Hi, I'm Tom Woods, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm your host, Doug Stewart, and today we're going to have a conversation about rich people, or actually we're going to have a conversation about what people think of rich people. I have a guest on, Dr. Rainer Zitelmann, who's an historian and sociologist. He's also a world-renowned author, successful businessman, and real estate investor. Zitelmann's books are successful all around the world, especially in China, India, South Korea, and in 2016, he was awarded his second doctorate in sociology with his thesis on the psychology of the super rich. His most recent book, which was published with the Cato Institute, is The Rich in Public Opinion, What We Think About When We Think About Wealth. And that's the topic of today's conversation. Rainer, thanks for being with us.
Yes, nice to meet you.
So when I saw one of the blurbs on the back of your book, one of the endorsements, it said that this was Atlas Shrugged with data and footnotes, or Atlas Shrugged with numbers and footnotes. And I was like, I have to read this because I know that Atlas Shrugged has this very, Ayn Rand's characters are very much made to be hated if they're rich, right? And so this is a book about what's actually happening in the real world, not just in the fictional world of Ayn Rand's mind, but what's happening in the real world with respect to the wealthy. And before we get into like the details, what motivated you to write a book on this topic?
I think there were several reasons. I had one experience. I'm based here in Berlin, and on the 1st May, there was a demonstration with posters, and the posters claimed, kill your landlord, kill your landlord. And I'm a landlord myself, and I wondered what would be the reaction if somebody would show a poster like kill, for example, black people or kill disabled people. Everyone would be rightly outraged about this. But with killing landlords, it seemed like funny. Or there was another article in one of the most important German news magazine, and the headline was to hell with the rich people. And at the same time, I made this thought experiment. What would have been the reaction with an article like to hell with, for example, Jewish people or something? Everyone would be outraged. And so I saw that the rich are the only minority where it's allowed to speak very negative and even with hate without having any negative consequences or even not criticism from anyone else. And this was one motive. And the other motive is I read a lot of books about prejudice research because I'm interested in this topic, prejudice and stereotypes, not only about rich people. I read a lot of books about prejudice against poor people. There is research, but prejudice against black people, prejudice against women, against gay people. But there are thousands of books and thousands of essays or papers in scientific journals. But there was not one book about prejudice and stereotypes about rich people. And this was the reason why I thought, okay, then I should write this book.
Mm-hmm. So with prejudices and stereotypes, I mean, those are two pretty common words that people have. And what's the relationship between them? And how do we think about, when we evaluate a class of people, whether it's rich, middle class, even poor, or even, some of the other traditional categories of people think in terms of, race, gender, orientation, things like that. How do we think about prejudices and stereotypes in terms of like, what does that actually mean to think about those things?
Usually it means that you generalize something from the behavior from one person to a group, or that you judge behavior from one person other as you would have if it was not a member of this group. And with rich people, for example, you see it now in the corona crisis. I don't know how it is in the United States, but in Germany, we have so many people who really hate Bill Gates. Because in the corona crisis, they are looking for scapegoats, like they people do always in crisis. And for them here, a lot of people believe that Bill Gates was the guy who made the coronavirus. He want to earn a lot of money with the vaccine against the coronavirus and so on. And this is an example because he's very rich, and so he's a scapegoat for them. And this happened every time in history, especially in times of crisis or things that people couldn't explain by themselves. If you remember, for example, in the Middle Ages, or there was the plague, and then the people told witches they made the plague, or Jewish people poisoned the well and they were responsible. And so it's always that people are looking to for scapegoats, especially in crisis. And this happens again and again. And last time that it happened was in the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, where you could read everywhere that greedy bankers are responsible for this crisis.
Yeah, in America, what I've noticed, at least from my friends on the left, and many of them are Christians, that they are concerned that during the coronavirus pandemic, their bank accounts, so to speak, well, that's the way they would perceive it, but their assets, their value has gone up while the rest of the country is burning, and people's bank accounts are dwindling, or they're going bankrupt, or they're out of healthcare or something like that. And so their perception is the wealthy are getting wealthier during this pandemic, and that's not right. That's been the observation I've seen, at least in my corner of the world.
Yes, but I can't understand, because most rich people are invested in the stock market, and in the now the stock market goes up again. But generally, if you look at the Dow Jones or the S&P, the S&P lost, and it's not different for rich people and everyone else. Everyone who is invested in stocks got losses as well in the corona crisis. Now it's getting a little bit better, but I think as well for people who are invested in real estate, especially in retail real estate or office real estate, because I think they will be affected through the crisis as well.
Yeah. And it's also, it's been like 3 months now. It's 4 months. It's a little too early to tell per se exactly what the ramifications are going to be long term. So it might be a little unfair, to assess things this soon.
I think Asian people are as well scapegoats now for the corona crisis in the United States. Isn't it true? I heard it that a lot of Asian people were attacked, and I think this has also something to do with stereotypes against successful, or prejudice against successful people. Because if you see I'm sure the income pyramid in United States is black people, Latino people, white people, and then Asian people. Asian people earning 40% more than white people and are more successful in university. And I appreciate, I like Asian people, but there are other people, envious people. For them, they are scapegoats, and as well, especially in the corona crisis, they were attacked. And I think this is a perfect example. What happens? There were prejudices before against Asian people. I read an essay in a scientific psychological journal. It was 12 years ago about prejudice against Asian Americans. So this is not a new topic, but in a crisis, then when people look for scapegoats, this latent prejudices became stronger then, and words can become deeds. This is what people forget always. For example, some people ask me, why do you write about prejudice against rich people? They have a good life. They are much better off than other minorities if you compare it with, for example, black people or other minorities. What is it about writing about prejudice against rich people? And I had to tell them that in the 20th century, very often rich people were killed and had to leave their country. And so if you think what happens with the Kuliks, for example, in the time of communism in Russia, something like 600,000 Kuliks were killed as rich peasants or farmers, and the same happened in China, and it happened with the Red Khmer in Cambodia and other countries. So sometimes people forget about it, that sure, today rich, they have a good life and it's good to be rich, but on the other hand, this can change in other circumstances. And so my book is a kind of warning what can happen, because this was often happened in history. First, there were stereotypes and negative prejudices against the minority. And then when it came to a crisis, then words became deeds. And this is a kind of warning.
Yeah. Well, one thing in your book that I kind of noticed early on when we're talking about prejudices is that I think there's this, you were kind of mentioning that there's this common perception that if somebody just got to know an individual Chinese person or an individual wealthy person or an individual, any group that they think sort of ill of or not very positively of, that would sort of overcome the prejudice, that, that they're just, it's just an error of, well, they just don't know the person, or they don't know many people of that particular, group that we're talking about.
Yes.
And you say it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's not a matter of, the antidote isn't necessarily being more knowledgeable.
We had one question that was only asked in the German poll. All other questions were asked in 4 different countries. And we asked people who knew a millionaire in person, what do you think about the millionaire that you know? And we gave them a list with personality traits. And the answer was 71% said industrious, 71% intelligent, 58% imaginative, 47% optimistic, 45% visionary. So, and now the contrast. If we asked the population in general, and most of them don't know a millionaire in person, which of the following are most likely to apply to rich people? And we gave them the same list with traits. The answer was in Germany 62% self-centered, 56% materialistic, 50% ruthless, 49% greedy, and 43% arrogant. So you see, it's a contrast whether you know people or rich people in person, or whether you don't know them. And the answers are quite different there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wasn't surprised by that, because I think people who know rich people actually realize that that's not stereotypes aren't exactly correct. So let's jump into the actual crux of the matter here. How unpopular are the rich? I mean, how bad is it?
I think you have to differentiate between countries, and this was the first time that international study was conducted. It has never been, no one had ever done it before, with the same questions in every country, with exception of this one question, but there were dozens of questions. And we had the same questions in United States, France, UK, and Germany. And then we calculated something that we called social envy coefficient. And what does it mean? We can measure with this the relation between envious and non-envious in every country, because we saw as a result of our questions that there are 2 different groups, social envious and non-envious. And in the middle, we called them the ambivalent people. And then we could calculate the ratio between both of these groups. And the higher the number is, the more envious is a country. And so the highest number was in France, with people being most envious. It was 1.21. Then came Germany with 0.97. And then was United States with 0.42 and UK with 0.37. So it means, to sum up, that people in Germany and in France are much more envious, have a much more negative attitude toward rich people than people in UK and United States. And people in UK and in United States have much more in common than, for example, have Britons with here Germany or France. So it's different for every country. And the second result, it depends on the age very much in the United States. We have a huge difference in the answers of older Americans and younger Americans, with being the younger Americans much, much more negative toward rich people than older Americans. And I think this is I think it's not so surprising if you see the big support that we had, for example, for Bernie Sanders with a lot of young people. But I can give you here one example for this. We asked the Americans, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? The more the rich have, the less there is for the poor. This is an example of what I call zero-sum thinking. And on average in America, 34% of the people agreed with the zero-sum thinking. So as mentioned before, people in the United States and UK are less envious as they are in France and Germany. But there's one exception, and this is with young Americans, because there's a huge difference between younger and older Americans. And I give you one example. We had this here, the following statement. The statement was, rich people are good at earning money, but they are not usually decent people. And we asked the people whether they agree or disagree with the statement. And for younger Americans, that means Americans between 18 and 29 years, under 30, 40% agreed with the statement. For older Americans, only 15% agreed with the statement. And then the numbers, how many people disagreed, only 23% of the young Americans under 30 disagreed with this statement that rich people are usually decent people. But for older Americans, 60 and older, 50% disagreed with the statement. And so it was with all other statements. For example, with this zero-sum belief statement, we had the statement, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? The more the rich have, the less there is for the poor. On average, 34% of Americans agreed with the statement, but with younger people, it was 45% agreed and 29% disagreed. The rest of them was not like neutral to the statement. And if you compare it with older people, 53% disagreed and only 24% agreed from people older than 60. And this was not only with these two questions, but this was with all other questions that younger people are much more critical in America against the rich. And this was not so in Europe. On the contrary, in Germany and in France, there was not such a big contrast between younger and older. But if there was a contrast, it was the other way around, that younger people were a little bit more positive about rich people than older people in France and in Germany. And in UK, we had, I think, there was no difference with the age group. So it's only in the United States that you have such an extreme negative attitude of young people against rich people.
So I was actually a little bit shocked by that statistic, because I feel like everybody has zero-sum thinking. And so that number is actually a little bit low for me. But, I'm sort of exaggerating or comparing to my exaggerated, concept of what people think. I can imagine our listeners listening to us talk about the rich here, and we're about halfway through this episode. And what is it that qualifies somebody as rich? I know that to some extent is a perceptual issue, some people think a lot of people are rich. Most people that live in the United States and Europe are rich by global standards. But that's going to need to be sort of spelled out a little bit with the way that you do research. So where do you have that in terms of your study and research?
Absolutely, it's a good question, because in the past there were a lot of polls about rich people, and they didn't define rich means, but we know from other studies that everyone has a quite different view what is rich people. For example, there was a poll in Germany, and they asked people who is rich, and the range was from earning, I translate now in dollar, from earning $3,000 a month to having more than 100 billion as the minimum to be rich. So it was so spread, and so everyone has another idea what rich means. And for our study, to avoid this, that everyone speaks about the same word, but it means something quite different for them, we gave to our interviewers a definition, and we said, this is someone who has $1 million in addition to his own residence. So if someone owns an own apartment or an own house, yes, in addition to this, he has to have at least 1 million. This was our definition.
Okay. So then why do people think, what does the data say about why people think that people are wealthy? I mean, there's a number of ways that we know people can become wealthy. They can simply earn it through, innovation, entrepreneurship. They can inherit it. What does the data say about how the public thinks about how the wealthy become wealthy?
Yes, there again, it's the difference between people who are this group that I call envious and not envious. Envious people think usually people become rich because they are tax cheats, because injustice in society, or because there are only heirs who become rich, there are not so many self-made people, or because they are dishonest and all this stuff. And other people who are not envious, they think more it's about hard work or being intelligent. But I think that both groups are wrong. Even I think the people who have a positive attitude toward rich people, and they think that hard work is the real reason why someone becomes rich. I don't agree. Sure, we know from research that rich people work longer than, for example, from the middle class. There was research in Germany, and the result was that rich people, they work 30% longer than people from the middle class. But to work 30% longer can't explain the difference why someone has net worth that is maybe 100 or even 1,000 times or more bigger as from another person. And I think that as well, people who like rich people and people who don't like rich people, that in a lot of ways they are wrong why people become rich. If you would ask me why people become rich, I would tell you most people became rich as entrepreneurs. That is true if you look at the list, the Forbes list of the richest people in the world or richest Americans, and you see if they haven't got it from their father or grandfather as heirs, then they are all entrepreneurs, and they became rich because they had good ideas. They were creative. This is why Jeff Bezos became the richest man in the world. Did he work maybe 100 times or 1,000 times longer as a taxi driver? No, I don't believe so. There are a lot of hardworking taxi drivers. So I would admit maybe a taxi driver, a lot of them in New York, they work as long as hard as Jeff Bezos does. So this is not the explanation. The explanation is that he had a great idea with Amazon, and Bill Gates had great ideas with Microsoft, and Larry Page and Sergey Brin had a great idea with Google, and Mark Zuckerberg had a great idea with Facebook. Or yes, you see, with I think the beginning of a big fortune and of wealth is usually a great idea. Sure, hard work is another thing, but I think that people who like the rich and who dislike the rich, most of them don't understand what is the most important thing, how to become rich. And in my opinion, it's to have a great idea.
Well, I would certainly agree, and of course, adding to that, having a great idea and being able to bring that to the good of others. You were talking about your research on envy, and you have a scale of those who are envious and non-envious. And obviously you can't ask somebody, are you envious? Because they're going to say no. But what did your research uncover?
Yes, you're absolutely right. You can't ask these people directly. I do it sometimes when I have my lectures, and I ask people if I have their scale from 1, that means I'm not envious at all, and 10, that means I'm extremely envious. And I asked who is between 1 and 3. Almost everyone raises his hand. And if I ask who is between 7 and 10, almost no one raises his hand. And so this is, we know it from psychological research that people don't admit that they are envious. They don't admit it for themselves. Why? Because if you admit being envious, then you admit that the other person has something that you want to have, that your desire. And then the next question is, why don't you have it? And sometimes this is not very good for your self-confidence to ask this question. But so we had an indirect approach to look whether people are envious or not. And we had a very narrow definition of envious people. And so sometimes people speak about they distinguish between something they called a positive or a good envy and a negative. But we had a very narrow definition. And this means social envious are not primarily motivated by the desire to improve their own situation in order to close the gap between themselves and the rich, but they are more concerned with making the life worse for the rich and take something away from them. And now the most important thing, even if this does not create any personal benefits for them. I will give you an example for one of the questions. We asked people, for example, we gave them the following statement: I think it would be fair to increase taxes substantially for millionaires, even if I would not benefit from it personally. And for example, in Germany, 65% agreed. United States, 47% agreed. France, 61% agreed. Or we had another statement. This was, I would favor drastically reducing managers' salaries and redistributing the money more evenly among their employees, even if that would mean that the employees would get only a few more dollars per month. So it's the same principle, to make the situation worse for one, but I have no advantage, only $2 or $3. And for example, in Germany, 46% agreed. In the United States, 31% agreed. In France, the most envious nation, 54% agreed with the statement. And the last example I want to give you, it's about Schadenfreude. We asked the people, when I hear about a millionaire who made a risky business decision and lost a lot of money because of it, I think it serves him right. And we asked people whether they agree or disagree with the statement. And now, I don't know whether you know that the word Schadenfreude is a German word. It's from German in English, yes, the same word, but it comes from Germany. And now you know why, because Germany was the only nation where we had more people, 40% who agreed with the statement than disagreed. 40% agreed, 37% disagreed. In the United States, it was 28% agreed and 29% disagreed. And if people answered positive to one of these statements, or if they supported one of these statements, then we didn't say he's envious, but if he supported a few of these statements, or whether he rejected all of these statements, this made a big difference as well with all other questions. We had a dozen of questions, but we found out that how people answer these 3 questions makes a difference with all other statements. For example, with zero-sum thinking and how they judge personality traits of rich people. And so in the end, we had these 3 groups: the envious, the non-envious, and the ambivalent people. And I think I spoke before about the social envy coefficient that we calculated as a result of this.
Yeah, well, and that envy reminds me of like, I don't know. It just seems fundamentally unchristian and just almost despicable for somebody to say, I simply want somebody that I envy their stuff. Now, they're not going to say it in that way, but they're, instead of envying what they have as if like, I want that, they're basically saying, I just don't want them to have it. Like, there's no good reason for them not to have it, but I just want that anyway. Like, it just seems fundamentally hateful. Now, obviously people, they're going to justify it through things like, well, we need to have equitable systems and, inequality is a problem, et cetera. But it just, in terms of an attitude, it just doesn't seem very charitable at all to consider anybody, in that way and just say, I just don't want them to have what they have. It's not like, oh, good for them. I hope I can get that someday, or I hope more people can get that someday. They're just,
absolutely
speaking terribly of other people. So one thing that I've actually had this thought while I read a little bit before I read your book. I read Capitalism and the Jews by Jerry Z. Muller, and it occurred to me as you talking about scapegoating in your book, which honestly I didn't know that would actually be one of the topics, and I'm really glad that it was. There's a little bit of like, maybe there's a silver lining in that the rich are somewhat scapegoated and maybe demonized, in that public attitudes used to be between about groups that were of a certain category, something like anti-Semitism or racial differences or ethnic differences. And maybe there's like, in terms of prejudice against people, being prejudiced against the rich really, I mean, is it sort of like the new anti-Semitism? So it's probably not as bad because it's not going to lead to such atrocities, or am I kind of like giving too much credit to the evolution of prejudice?
I have some, I wrote my first doctoral thesis about Adolf Hitler's economic and social thought. This was the topic of my first doctoral thesis, as well in English, Hitler, the Policy of Seduction. And here in my new book, I have a quote, for example, from Adolf Hitler. Maybe you would be surprised if you hear this. For example, Hitler declared in 1933 that if he had turned against communism, and now quote, then it was not because of the 100,000 bourgeois. It can be of complete indifference whether they go under or not. And he said to Bolshevism has simply removed its creatures because they were worthless for mankind, only burdens for their nation. The bees also string the drones to death when there's nothing left for them to contribute to the hive. The Bolshevist procedure is therefore something quite natural. So this was a quote from Adolf Hitler, for example, and Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitism was also linked with his anti-capitalism very much. You can read it in Mein Kampf, and you can read it as well in his first speeches. Yes, for example, I have here one quote. This was from a speech from Adolf Hitler in 1920, and the topic of the speech was, "Why are we anti-Semites?" And I quote now, and so you see the parallels between prejudice against Jewish people and against rich people. Now the quote from Adolf Hitler: "Therefore this capital grew and today rules practically the whole world, immeasurable as to the amounts in this gigantic relationships, growing, and the worst part, completely corrupting all honest work, because that is the horrible part, that the normal human being who today has to bear the burden of the interest on this capital has to stand by and see how, despite diligence, industry, despite real work, hardly anything is left to him with which only to feed himself, and even less to clothe himself, at the same time as this international capital devours billions in interest alone, which he has to help pay," and so on. So anti-Semitism, Adolf Hitler was also linked with anti-capitalism, and it was often in history.
So there's plenty we could continue talking about, but I would encourage readers to pick up a copy of your book and get to some of the other things that are in it. There was one sort of ironic point made at the very, very end of the book. And it's answering the question, like, why is the perception like this? And there's a little bit of like, well, the rich are to blame for their own perception. Can you explain that? Like, what responsibility does the rich have in terms of like, well, you look this way because you don't defend yourself, is sort of what I read you saying. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I think the rich should learn from other minorities. Look, for example, how the attitude changed towards gay people, for example, in the last 50 years, or to other groups in our society, how attitudes changed maybe towards women or towards black people. And in all these cases, it was the effort of these minorities who did something against this prejudice and stereotypes. There were, for example, a lot of Jewish people who did research about anti-Semitism, and a lot of women in research about gender prejudice and so. But rich people, I think they do almost nothing. They are silent in our society. They don't defend themselves. You see, as an example, my book, it cost me a lot of money to commission this poll in 4 countries. And I had much more research in this book about media stereotypes about rich people. And this was not all my own research. I had to commission this polls and institute. It cost me almost like $150,000 to do this, and I will never earn it with this book, not by far. I could finance it because I'm rich myself, yes, so I could finance it. But I had the plan to establish something like an institute for research about this question, about how people become rich and prejudice against rich and all these questions. And I tried to get support from other rich people, and I know a lot of rich people, but I got no one who wanted to support it. Maybe it's harder in Germany as it is in the United States, because in the United States you have some of these libertarian think tanks. But I can tell you, even, I don't want to mention any name, but even from some of these libertarian think tanks, if I sent them the book, one answered me, "Oh, I don't think that it's really interesting topic for us, because rich people, there is a lot of reason why there are prejudice against them. Look, their bailout in Wall Street, and look what Bill Gates did." And this was not from any leftist people, so it was from libertarian, yes. So
yeah,
where
right.
I would never expect this, that you even have there this prejudice and this stereotypes. And I think rich people should learn from other minorities. If you want to change something, then you have to do something. You have to explain people what you are doing. You have to do something to educate people. And I think it's not with one book or one article. I hope my book is only the first one, and that other people will follow, because as mentioned before, we have thousands of books about prejudice against other minorities, and we have almost nothing about this topic, and I hope it's only the first book.
Well, I think this might be a good time for you to have that conversation with more libertarians. It might be more opportune because the public opinion of wealthy people in the wake of COVID and the shutdowns and the stock market and a whole bunch of other things, you might have some more opportunity. And I'm glad we at LCI have been able to give you an opportunity to get your message out. We do have a largely United States-based listenership. So I really thank you for being on and being able to share your message with our audience.
I appreciate very much. I'm so happy, and please excuse me. You see, my English is not as good as it should be, but hopefully everyone could understand the message. And if not, please read my book. You can order it with Amazon, and I hope there will be a discussion about this topic in the United States as well.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thanks again for being on.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group you are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. If you'd like to find out more about LCI, visit us on the web at libertarianchristians.com. The voiceovers are by Matt Bellis and Catherine Williams. As of episode 115, our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.
Hey, podcast listeners. Since you like listening to audio content, we wanted to let you know about a new audiobook titled Called to Freedom: Why You Can Be Christian and Libertarian. It's read by me, Jacqueline Isaacs, one of the contributing authors of the book, and every download helps to support the Libertarian Christian Institute. To learn more and to download the audiobook today, go to calltofreedombook.com.